Suppose I jumped out of an airplane, and with or without a parachute, but I'm going down with my parachute, right, like this. My body would be in the same, intrinsically, inwardly, right, as it is now, right? Huh? Or could be, right?
Yeah.
But am I standing?
No.
No. In order to be standing, I have to have something outside of me, and my parts are what? Arranged in a kind of particular way down to that outside thing, the floor, right? If I were to lie down on the floor, which I'm not going to do here, but that would be another position, right? Lying down. And then my parts would be what? Ordered to the floor in a different way than they are when I'm standing up, right? Okay? If I stood on a chair, as we do sometimes to reach something, right? I'm not sitting, right? Huh? Okay. But I'm standing, huh? Okay? Now, Thomas points out that in the idea of time, and you'll find it out when we take up time, it already includes the idea of before and after in order. So you don't have a special, what? Another category corresponding to time. This does here. So when I say I'm in this room, that says nothing about the way my parts are arranged. Am I standing in this room? Am I sitting in this room? Am I lying down in this room, right? Right? Okay. But time itself already involves the idea of before and after. You'll see that in the definition of time. It's the number of motion according to before and after motion. But that's perhaps the reason why when Aristotle gives the central meanings of the word before, the first meaning is before in what? Time, rather than before in place. Before in place is led back to that as a similarity to before in time. But it's more explicit in time that you have before and after. Now, with cause or effect, he has two of them, acting upon and undergoing. Usually they use the Latin words action, passion, but I like to use the word acting upon, undergoing, being acted upon. Okay? So I am what? Kicking you, or I am being kicked, right? Or the fire is heating the water is being heated, right? Huh? Okay. Now notice the difference between saying that the fire is hot and the fire is what? Heating, huh? The water. The fire is said to be hot in itself. That would be put in quality, a sensible quality. The fire is hot, right? But say the fire is heating something, right? You've got to bring in something outside of it that it is acting upon, right? Huh? And likewise, when the water there on the stove, to say the water is hot or is warm is talking about a quality that it has now, right? But when you say the water is being heated, then you're bringing in something but outside of it, huh? Okay. So, you always divide it into two or three, right? Two or three men. You have the famous example of Christianity of the Ten Commandments, right? Huh? But already, the two tablets you have 3 and what? 7, yeah. And then what? The 7 are divided into what? Well, the affirmative and the negative commandments, right? So you're dividing by 2 or 3 when you try to explain those, huh? Okay. And then you start to divide them into what? Deeds and words and desires, right? Huh? So, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, right? Those are deeds, right? And don't bear false testimony, that's words. And then don't covet your neighbor's wife, don't covet your neighbor's oxen and so on, right? That's desire, right? Yeah, it's a division to 3, yeah? Used in confession sometimes, or in the thought, word, and deed, right? Desire, word, deed. So you divide them into 2 or 3 to eventually get the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. God, our enlightenment, guardian angels, strengthen the lights of our minds, order and illumine our images, and arouse us to consider more. So today we're going to talk about the second part of the art of definition, but we also talk about division. But definition is the chief tool there for understanding what a thing is, and division is a secondary tool, and division is also partly a way of arriving at definitions too. So we call this whole thing the art of definition, but we talk mainly about definition. Just like in the logic of the third act, we often say the chief subject is the syllogism. But the syllogism is not the only kind of argument. There are other kinds of argument that are considered there as well. Okay? Now, he mentioned two things here in the little preamble there. That definition and division are two ways our reason goes from a confused to a distinct knowledge. And two ways that we do so in every form of reasoned out knowledge. So you gentlemen have considered a little bit of Euclid, for example, right? And you must have seen that he began with a number of definitions, right? And with a number of what? Divisions, right? And every reasoned out knowledge does that. So Aristotle, in the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics, he's going to define moral virtue, right? And then he's going to eventually divide moral virtue. So, and we saw also the natural road, that one before and after along the natural road is that we know things in a, what? Confused way before we know them distinctly. And the classical text for that is in the beginning of Aristotle's 8 books of natural hearing, the so-called physics. And when we do a little natural philosophy, we'll go more deeply into the fact that we know things in a confused way before distinctly. But every student's experience of studying should tell them that that is in fact the truth. And so these are two ways that reason uses to go from the confused to the distinct. Definition and what? Division. And he says also in the premium, we must think out definitions and divisions before we reason out conclusions. I think I've talked here before a bit about those key words, thinking out, right? And reasoning out is one form of thinking out, right? Reasoning out is thinking out a conclusion. But there's maybe at least 7 different senses of thinking out, corresponding to 7 different senses of the word out, corresponding to 7 senses of the word in, right? Actually, there's 8 senses, but maybe there are 8 senses of thinking out. But clearly, in reason out knowledge, you're going to find at least these 7 different senses of thinking out. And the definition, of course, is especially important for what we call the syllogism later on. Most people don't see that connection. It's interesting when Aristotle is remarking there, I think it's in the Metaphysics, he's remarking that Socrates was trying to syllogize. And he gives as a sign that Socrates was trying to syllogize the fact that he was always trying to define. Because definition is the beginning of a syllogism. Okay. Now, in the first section here, the two kinds of definition. We distinguish between the definition of a thing and the definition of a what? Name. And what we're chiefly concerned with is the definition of a thing. But sometimes you have to define a name. You have to use some words to make known what the word or name means. But that's not the main kind of definition. It's a very strange statement there, I guess, in John Stuart Mill's it. He says, all definitions are of names and of names only. I can't imagine where they get this idea. What we're chiefly interested in is in knowing things, right? And not the meaning of names. It's important to know the meanings of names. You're going to use names. You've got to use names. So you have to stop sometime and see what the words mean, right? If it's not clear. But to say that's the only thing, it's laughable, right? But you find that thought. I remember reading one time in Heisenberg's different lectures. Now, Heisenberg is one of the greatest scientists. Some people say he's next to Einstein, right? But Heisenberg is a very wise man. I have tremendous admiration for Heisenberg and I learned a lot from him. But, in alluding to Plato, he speaks of the dialogues as if Plato or Socrates is mainly concerned about the meaning of names. Well, somehow that idea got into the modern mind somewhere, and it just makes definition something relatively secondary, right? When actually the definition of a thing is what we're chiefly interested in, and the definition of a thing is very often a major accomplishment, And it takes sometimes a long time to arrive at a good definition of a thing, and very few arrive. And even those who do arrive at a good definition, it takes the rest of us a long time to understand that. Descartes quotes the definition of motion, which is very important in natural philosophy, in a garbled fashion, and he says, "Who understands that?" That's it. Doesn't realize, there's really a major work there to think out the definition of motion, and even to understand the definition of motion when someone else has thought it out. We have a good example of that in the definition of reason, right? As the ability for a large discourse looking before and after. It took a long time for us to understand what discourse means or large means and so on. Okay. Now in the second paragraph here, I give two definitions of definition, right? And one is speech signifying what a thing is. Now, as we mentioned here many times, logic is chiefly about three speeches. And we define speech as vocal sound, signifying by custom, by human agreement, having parts that signify by themselves, that five-part definition. And logic is mainly about three speeches: definition, statement, and then syllogism. And definition is speech signifying what a thing is. Just as statement, which we'll be studying after definition and division, is speech signifying the true or the false. Okay? And the syllogism, which we'll be studying after statement, is speech in which some statements laid down, another follows necessarily because of those laid down. Okay? Now sometimes I'm tempted to stick another word in here and say it's speech signifying what a thing is distinctly, right? Because a name can signify what something is too, right? But the speech signifies distinctly what it is. So if I say, what is this? You could answer, well, that's a square, right? And the word square would signify what this is. That's what this is a square. But not as distinctly as the speech. Well, it's a quadrilateral, right? That's equilateral and what? Right angled, right? So square and equilateral and right angled quadrilateral signify the same thing. They both signify what this is, but the one signifies more distinctly than the other. Okay? But then sometimes I'm drawn back and say, well, nothing too much, right? If a man understands what a speech is and the difference between a speech and a name, then he should see that a speech that has parts that signify by themselves, right? The speech as a whole, being composed of those many names, right? Necessarily will signify more distinctly, right? What a thing is than one name is. Huh? Okay? Square is an example of a name. It's a vocal sound signifying by custom, no part of which signifies anything by itself, right? While the definition, equilateral and right-angled quadrilateral, is a speech having parts that signify by themselves. Huh? And therefore it can kind of blow up, you might say, expand, let you see more distinctly what the thing is. Huh? Okay? So maybe it's superfluous, right, to say speech signifying what a thing is distinctly, because a speech is going to do that, because it is a speech, more so than a name, right? Okay. Nevertheless, you should see that a definition is signifying distinctly what the thing is, huh? But it can do so because it's a speech and not just a what? Name. Huh? If the definition of speech and name are the first definitions of logic, then the first postulates would be no speech is a name, or no name is a speech. And every speech is composed of names. Okay. Now, a second definition of definition. Aristotle often compares definition with syllogism or definition of demonstration. Huh? And when you meet the definition of demonstration later on in the logic of the third act, Aristotle would define the demonstration as a syllogism, right? Making us know the cause and that of which it is a cause, and that it cannot be otherwise. But he puts in the definition of demonstration, that's a syllogism, making something known, right? And so sometimes in a kind of imitation of that, I define definition. I'm talking now about definition of a thing, right? If I just say definition period, I'm thinking of definition of a thing, right? I'm not a modern in that sense. I'm a Greek. Okay? Mm-hmm. So sometimes I define definition as speech making known what a thing is. So it's clearly we're talking about a definition of a thing here when we use the word thing definition here. Speech making known what a thing is. So I ask my students sometimes, what in arithmetic is a perfect number? Huh? And I know they kind of know what an odd number is, what an even number is, but none of them seem to know what a perfect number is, right? Okay? Now, how would I make known to them what a perfect number is? I can give examples. 6 is the first perfect number, 28 is the second perfect number. But what is a perfect number? They don't know. But I can make known to them what a perfect number is, just as what it is was made known to me by Euclid's what? Definition. Huh? A perfect number is a number, right, equal to the sum of everything that measures it. Measures now in the strict sense, measures it evenly, right? So 4 is not a perfect number. 4 is measured by 1, and it's measured by 2, that's it. And 1 plus 2 don't have to 4, do they? 5 or 3 or 2 are measured only by 1, which doesn't have to now. So the first perfect number is actually what? 6. It's measured by 1, by 2, and by what? 3, but not by 4 or by 5. And 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals what? 6, right? So when St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas talk about creation in 6 days, right? They see a meaning in the word 6 there, right? As the first perfect number. And the things it measured are perfectly ordered, 1, 2, 3. Okay? And you see this in Plato's great dialogue, the Symposium, right? Where there are 6 speakers. 3 rhetoricians, 2 poets, 1 philosopher. 1, 2, 3. You go around the table from the lesser to the greater, right? Okay. But notice, I'm making known what a perfect number is, right? Through a definition, right? When I give them Shakespeare's exhortation, I tell them it's written in what? Blank verse. Now, y'all know what blank verse is? Once in a while you have one student who knows. Most of them don't know, right? So I say, well, blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter, right? And now I've made known what it is. If they know what unrhymed is, and iambic is, and pentameter is. If they don't know what an iamb is, I'll make that known by definition. It's 2 syllables with the accent on the second. Okay? So it's speech making known what a thing is. And that fits into Shakespeare's definition there of reason, right? It's the ability for discourse, right? Now remember the definition of discourse? It's coming to know what you don't know through what you do know, right? And the 2 kinds of discourse that are especially studied in logic are defining and reasoning, right? And in defining, you're making known, as Albert the Great says, the simple unknown, what something is, right? And in reasoning, you're making known the complex unknown, a statement, right? Where you affirm or deny one thing or another. So this fits in very much with what Shakespeare is saying there, right? Defining is a form of discourse. Okay. So I make known what something is through the parts, right? Okay. Now, perhaps we want to give a third definition of a thing. If you go back to the words of the great Heraclitus, there, the central thinker in human thought, he has a beautiful statement. He says, nature loves to hide. Okay? And when you find Heraclitus saying something like that, I always think of what Aristotle says, I believe in the Politics there, where he says, we should try to say some things better than our predecessors, right? And other things as well as they said them. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, a thinker says something so well that you don't try to improve upon it, right? And this is one of those examples, right? Nature loves to hide. Nature loves to hide. Now, if you study the word nature, and the most full study of that is in the 5th book of Wisdom, the 5th book of the so-called metaphysics, right? Where Aristotle distinguishes the basic central meanings there of the word nature. But all of them have the idea of something within, and therefore something that is hidden to us, at least in the beginning. So the first meaning of nature is birth, right? Well, birth is from within, right? And the baby, at least before some of those devices, right? The baby was what? Hidden. You didn't know it's going to be a boy or a girl. Anything until the baby what? Comes forth, right? Okay. So it's the idea that the hidden is in that first meaning. And then later on, in natural philosophy, nature takes on the sense of a beginning and cause of motion or change that's within a thing, right? And eventually the word nature takes on the sense of what a thing is, the nature of the thing, a very broad meaning. But even there, the nature of the thing, or what it is within it, right? And therefore somewhat hidden, right? So, you might define definition then as speech bringing out what a thing is. And notice we sometimes use that phrase talking about the mind, right? To bring out something, right? Okay. Well, that's a form of what? Thinking out, right? Okay. And when you thought out, or it's a result of thinking out something, right? When you thought out something, you brought out that thing, whatever it is, right? Okay. So it's speech bringing out what a thing is. So Aristotle must have thought a lot about what motion is before he was able to bring out what it is. Okay? And that's true of all the great definitions. Boethius thought out the definition of eternity, right? In the Consolation of Philosophy. And if you look in the Summa there, Thomas says, what? Question on the eternity of God, right? And it's kind of beautiful the way he proceeds. Thomas has the objections, right? He objects to every part of Boethius' definition, right? Because he got to accept, right? Then he explains the definition in the body of the article, and then replies to each objection, right? So he concentrates your mind on every single word, right? See, wise and slow, right? It's a magnificent definition. Boethius. We also have the definition of person, right? That Boethius thought out. Thomas does the same thing with that, right? It takes a while. So it's speech bringing out what a thing is. That's another way you could define the definition of a what? Thing. Yeah. Now I'll give you a little tongue twister, right? Notice how logic here, in a way, in definition here, it reflects the nature of reason that Thomas spoke of in the premium there to logic, the major premium, that reason can think not only about other things and about how to use your hands or your feet to do things, but reason can also think about its own act. Reason can reflect, we say. It means to come back in a way upon itself. But there's something like that when you have a definition now, not of other things, but a definition of definition, right? And you can make statements about cats and dogs and all kinds of things, but you can also make statements about statements, right? You can reason about all kinds of things, but you can also reason about reasoning, right? Okay? Now my tongue twister. Is the definition, right, of the definition of a thing, right? Is the definition of definition, right? Is it a definition of that definition?
Yes.
I would say no. The definition of the definition of a thing, right, is not a definition of what? Definition of the definition of a thing.
Because it's not a thing.
No. See? In other words, this is the definition of definition, right?
Yes, because the thing is not a speech.
Okay. But this could be said of the definition I gave a little while ago of a square, right? Okay. So the definition of definition is not a definition of that definition in particular, is it? It's a definition of any definition of a thing, right? See? Now, so I define definition as speech signifying what a thing is. The definition of square, right, is speech signifying what a thing is, right? This is in a way common, isn't it, to all definitions? Huh? Okay. One thing is something more general there. You can have a thought about a thing, right? Then you can have a thought about your thought, right? But can you have a thought that's about itself? Can you?
Yes. It's a thought that's common to all thought.
Yeah, you have a thought about what's common to all thoughts, right? And you have a thought that's just about itself in particular.
Are you talking about a particular instance of a thought? Because if you reflect on a thought that you've had, you're bringing that one thought back again. So you're reflecting on that thought. But if you're talking about a thought at that very instant, no.
Okay? You have a thought about a thought. Is it the same thought as the first thought? It isn't. You know? Is it even the same in kind? Huh?
No, you'll be trying to penetrate it further.
Suppose I have a thought of a triangle, right? And then I have a thought about the thought of a triangle, right? Well, the thought of the triangle is about what? Triangle, right? And the thought about the thought of a triangle is a thought about a thought. Right? That's never really exactly the same, is it? Right? God gets closer to this, but he doesn't have any thoughts. So that's a little aside there, huh?
Your question?
Just to make you think a little more.
Definition of a definition.
We define definition of a thing, right? Huh? And I gave 3 definitions of it in a sense. Huh? But this is not said only the definition of a thing. It said the definition of square and definition of circle and definition of motion and so on, right? Each of them is a definition in this sense. Huh? Yeah. Then I define the definition of a name, and that's speech making clear the meaning of a name. Huh? It's a much less rigorous thing. Okay. Now, what is the order of these 2 kinds of definition? Huh? Definition of a thing and the definition of a name. Huh?
The definition of the name seems to be before in the third sense of before.
Okay.
In the definition of the thing.
Okay. In the Posterior Analytics, Aristotle has a famous discussion there, the second book of the Posterior Analytics, which is perhaps the greatest book in logic, where he speaks of 4 questions, right? And the questions are, does it exist? And then the question, what is it? And then, whether this is that, okay, or I want to say, is this that? And then the question, why is this that? So I might ask the question, does the atom exist, right? And if I answer yes to that question, right, then I'll say, what is the atom, right? Okay. I might ask, does man laugh? And if the answer is yes, then I ask, why does man laugh, right? Okay. Is the light of the sun cut off during the day? Yes. And then I say, why is it cut off, right? Okay. Was the government of Saudi Arabia overthrown? The answer is yes. Why was it overthrown, right? Okay. He sees an order among these questions, right? The question, does it exist, comes before the question, what is it? And the question, is this that, before, why is this that, right? Okay. Now, when you ask, does something exist, you can't just use the word it, or the pronoun it. You've got to use what? The name of the thing, right? Huh? And so you have to have some meaning in mind for the name, right? And there may be something out there corresponding to it, right? There may not be, right? Huh? Okay. Do vitamins exist? It's not obvious that vitamins exist, right? Well, what do you mean by vitamin? Right? Do atoms exist, right? What do you mean by an atom, right? Okay. Now, in that sense, the definition of the name would come before even the question, does it exist, right? Do unicorns exist, right? Okay, does Santa Claus exist? And so on, right? Huh? Do mermaids exist, right? In the account of Columbus's first voyage there's sighting of mermaids. Huh? I don't know if anybody knows exactly what they had in mind. What did you mean that you saw, right? Huh? One of the mysteries of history, right? In theology, when you ask, does God exist, right? You got to have some meaning to the word what? God, right? Okay. So that's one way that the definition of the name comes what? Before, right? You don't really have a definition of a thing in the strict sense, or as such, until you know that the thing in some way exists, right? And then you seek to know what that thing is. Huh? But you can have a definition of the name even if there's no thing corresponding to it in reality. So as I mentioned the word unicorn there, or mermaid and so on, even if there's no such thing in the world, right, as a unicorn with a horse with a lance coming out of its forehead, as it were, and a mermaid, a half woman, half fish, even if there's no such thing, you still have a meaning for the word, right? Okay? Do you see that? Okay. But there'd be no definition of the thing, because there's no thing corresponding to that. Huh? It's a figment of the imagination, I guess, to the best of my knowledge, right? Mermaid and centaur and unicorn and so on, right? Now, another reason why you might have to find a name before you define the thing is that the definition itself, like every speech, is composed of names, right? So if you didn't know the meaning of a name, I might have to what? Explain what that word means. Huh? Okay? So you can see something of the order there, right? Now, when Aristotle gets to the postulalytics and he's talking about episteme, like geometry and so on, then you come back to the definitions of, say, Euclid there in Book 1, right? And when he first defines these things, are those definitions of things, or are some of them just definitions of names? Huh? How should you understand those? Huh? Well, if you looked at the first theorem in Euclid, it's a construction of a what?
Equilateral.
Yeah. So, in a way, the existence of the equilateral triangle is not presupposed to proposition 1, right? Okay? So, in that sense, when you first define right angle, equilateral triangle, right? You're not yet what? Talking about a thing, huh? Okay? And then you show that there is such a thing by what? Constructing it in imagination. Okay? In the same way with right angle, right? So, is it possible to draw a straight line using a straight line such as to make equal angles? Huh? Okay. Well, later on, Euclid is going to have a theorem there for the construction of a right angle. Huh? So maybe some of the definitions there, when they're first given, they're definitions of names, right? Later on, it might become the definition of the thing, right? But there has to be something that you start off with that's existing, like the point or the line or something of this sort, right? Okay. So, that's some subtle things there, right? So in order to understand even Euclid fully and perfectly, you have to know some logic, right? Although it's such an easy science, as Thomas says, even the boy can learn it, right? You learn it in high school to some extent. Very familiar. Okay? So we're going to be concerned now principally with the definition of a thing from now on in our discussion here. Now we're going to give here actually 3 fundamental distinctions among definitions of things. And the first two are very similar, right? But they're stated a little bit differently, and it's good to outward knowledge of the thing, right? Okay. And notice how that order reflects the natural world, right? We know things in an outward way before inwardly. That was one of the, it's the second before and after there in the order in which we know the same thing. Huh? And the reason why we do that is because our knowledge starts with our senses. And the senses have a kind of outward knowledge of things. And so outward in English is almost a synonym for sensible, right? The outward appearance of something. And so, and secondly, the third thing we said about the order in which we know the same thing, we know it in a confused way, right? Before distinctly. And the inserting gives you a very confused knowledge, right? When I say that wisdom is the best knowledge, it gives you a very confused and indistinct knowledge of what wisdom really is. Huh? So because we know things in a confused way before distinctly, we tend to encircle things before we define them fully, right? And, someone asks me, what is a dog, right? I say, well, it's an animal. I say, well, so is a man. Well, it's a 4-foot animal, not a 2-foot animal. I say, well, so is a cat, right? And then my mind breaks down. And I say, well, the dog is a 4-footed animal that barks, right? And the cat is a 4-foot animal that meows. That's as far as my mind is able to penetrate. See? Well, it's kind of an outward knowledge of the dog, right? Somewhat, huh? And the cat, but do something that is what? Sensible, the barking or the meowing, right? Huh? So that's where we tend to know things. And when I define virtues of praiseworthy quality, notice as a child, certain things, your parents frown upon you doing, right? And you learn about that. You don't do that, right? But you see not what is intrinsically bad about it at first, right? But just that it's something you're going to be blamed for or criticized for doing, right? And other things you're praised for, right? Huh? If you're generous and you share your candy with your brother or sister or something, you're praised, huh? Okay? One of my little grandchildren there, she got, it was her birthday and she got some presents, right? And one little package had 2 things in it, right? And she said, oh, one for me and one for Sarah. She gave one to her sister right away. And everybody's so pleased with that, that kind of generosity, right? And it's just automatically did it, right? So you're praised for some things, and other things, you're spanked or people frowning at what you're doing, right? And that praise or that frown or that blame is something outside, right? But more known to you than the inward goodness or badness of the thing, huh? And later on you try to bring out the inward goodness or badness of the thing, right? So this is a very important distinction. But notice also, as they say, with the use of the word, right? See, somebody might say, you say, what is wisdom? And I say, it's the best knowledge. And someone might come back and say, you really haven't told me what it is, right? And it's only in a very imperfect way that I told him what wisdom is. And so you might, in one sense, say, that's not really a definition. Oh, let's call it drawing a line around. Huh? Okay. But a very important distinction. Huh? And it's a mistake, except perhaps in geometry or arithmetic maybe, where things are very, superficial, meaning on the surface of things, right? To try to begin with the definition in the full sense. Huh? We tend to have to separate things first, and then gradually, as we're filled in with something more inward, right? To penetrate, huh? Okay. Now, in the next section there, I come back here upon these. As you mentioned before, if the first definitions of logic, certainly very close to the first thing, are the definition of speech, right? Because logic is about these speeches, and the definition of name. Then perhaps the first statements that are kind of obvious from these definitions are that no speech is a name, or vice versa, right? No name is a speech. And then the other one, a little more subtle, that every speech is composed of names. Huh? Okay. Now some speeches are composed of other speeches, but eventually you get down to names. Huh? So in the next section, we talk about the names that you have in these two, right? And in the definition, in the full sense, you have the genus and what they call the differences, or to use the fuller phrase, the species making differences. Okay? Right, in certain, instead of the species making difference, you have something in the way of a property, right? Or some combination of common attributes, right? That separates them. Okay? So, really, to be the best knowledge, say, to be better than other forms of knowledge is not really the very nature of wisdom, but it's like a property of wisdom, or a result of what wisdom is. And likewise, to bark is not what makes a dog to be a dog, but something that follows upon what a dog is. Okay? So we tend to use the genus here and differences, as we learned them in Euclid, or in Porphyry. And here you have maybe the genus, but not the difference, right? And you have a property or something common, like best or something of that sort, right? Okay? I mentioned somewhere in the text there, if you don't have to do that in math, but if someone was to define a triangle as a rectilineal plane figure with the least sides, he really hasn't told you what a triangle is. See? But to have the least sides is a result of the fact that you can't contain a space with less than 3 lines, right? But it'd be stupid to do that in geometry, right? Because it's so clear that a triangle has 3 sides, right? Okay. Yeah. So it's superficial philosophy without wanting to hunt too much in the word, but everything's on the surface, right? And other things are not on the surface. Your courage, your temperance, or your vices are what? Not on the surface of you, right? It's kind of hidden, deep down in you, right? Especially pride. Yeah. This word stubborn, which is type of pride, comes from the idea of what? The stub, the root of a tree. Huh? And if you ever take a tree or something out, you realize that it's pretty easy to chop the top part down, but then to get the roots out is really resist, right? Even in a checkbook, you have something what they call stub. That part it's hard to come out. The other part, where you're going to pay, that comes out easily because but the stub stays in there, right? So deep down within you, there's these virtues or vices, right? And they were hidden to us. Okay. So now we have the distinction of those two, and we've gone a little bit into the names they're composed of, right? Okay. And that's necessary because you have to take something apart to know it fully, right? Okay. Now, in the second half of page 3, we come to another way of distinguishing definitions of the things. It's almost the same as this, but it's a little bit different. And we might call it definition by cause and definition by effect. Okay. And the definition by cause is a more perfect definition, because the causes are what makes the thing to be what it is. The effect is really a result of what the thing is. Okay? So the definition by cause is something like the definition in the full sense, right? And the definition by effect is something like the definition that we call it in Euclid. Okay? But instead of speaking of genus and difference, or genus and property, or something like a property, we speak of definition by cause or definition by effect. Okay? And sometimes this distinction is a more natural one to use in certain contexts. And the clear example there would be taught us by Socrates in the Euthyphro, right? Where Euthyphro is trying to define what piety is, right? Or what the pious is. And the definition he comes up with finally is the pious is what the gods approve of, right? Or the pious is what pleases the gods. And then Socrates asked the famous question, well, is it pious because it pleases the gods, or does it please the gods because it is pious? In a sense, he's asking, are you defining piety by its cause or by its effect, right? Okay. Now, later on in ethics, you'll see at the beginning of ethics, you meet what is called the first definition of good. And we'll examine that at some time. But the first definition of good is that good is what all desire. Okay? But you could ask the Socratic question about that, right? Is it good because we desire or want it? Or do we want it because it is good, right? See? Now it makes all the difference in your understanding of that definition. And therefore your understanding of good, and eventually bad and so on, and better, worse. It all depends upon your understanding of that definition. Is it a definition by cause, or is it a definition by effect? And actually it's a definition by effect, but you have to, show that by an interesting discourse that maybe we'll have when we study a little bit in Nicomachean Ethics, right? But so, this distinction between definition by cause and definition by effect is a natural distinction to use or to have in mind in understanding Socrates' question. And as Heisenberg said, right, it's the Greeks who taught us how to ask questions of principle. And they gave us the most powerful tool the Western mind has, he says. And, I learned to ask the question about the definition of good from Socrates and Euthyphro, right? Okay. And I was reading, I think it's in the De Vera Religione there, of St. Augustine, and he quotes the common definition of the beautiful. The beautiful is that which pleases when what? Seen, right? And St. Augustine asks the Socratic question, right? Kind of question. Is it beautiful because it pleases us when we see it? Or does it please us when we see it because it is beautiful? Augustine says, I have no doubt that it pleases us because it is beautiful, right? So that definition of the beautiful is a definition by what? Effect, right? Okay, now again, you could discuss that. Probably if we can understand it, you need a discourse about that. But your whole understanding of the beautiful depends upon that. Is that first definition of the beautiful, that which pleases when seen, right? Is that definition by cause or by effect, right? Your whole understanding of the fine arts, right? The arts of the beautiful, in a sense, the Beaux-Arts, right? It's called, right? Depends upon this, right? Because if you say it's beautiful because it pleases us, then you're really not saying that the beautiful is anything in the thing. It's just the effect it has upon us. But if you say it pleases us because it is beautiful, then beauty is something in the thing. The same way about the good, right? If it's good because I want it, then good is nothing in the thing, really. It's something we say about the thing because I happen to want it, right? But if I want it because it is good, then the good is in things. Huh? So the whole of ethics depends upon understanding whether that definition of good is by cause or by effect. If you don't understand that, you don't understand anything, right? I tell my students sometimes when you discuss that definition now, start to raise the question, I'm going to tell your parents you don't understand good and bad. And they don't, right? Sometimes when we talk about comedy in kind of a loose sense, we say comedy is a likeness of the what? Laughable, right? Okay. Now, is that a definition by cause or by effect? Comedy is a play that makes you laugh. Yeah. By tragedy, makes you weep, right? So we tend to define things often by effect first, right? And many times you don't get any further than that, because, as you saw in our study of the natural road, the effect is usually more known to us than the cause. And that's because the road goes from the senses into reason, and the senses know more effects than causes. And so every time we ask the question why, we know the effect, but not the what? Cause. I notice this is almost the same distinction as that, but it's stated a little bit differently, right? I could say to bark is a property of the dog, right? And so I define the dog as a 4-foot animal that barks. I'm defining him not by its species making difference, but by property, right? You also say that to bark is an effect of the dog, right? He's not a dog because he barks, right? I might recognize him to be a dog because he barks, right? Went to Mass this morning and somebody comes to church there and leaves their dog in their car there, right? And she has to walk by the car. Everybody's kind of laughing about this, you know, whose dog it is. And everyone's, you know, see who it is. But, you know, it's not a dog because it barks, really, but because it is a dog, it barks, right? So the bark is really an effect of its being a dog. It's not a cat because it meows, see? But it meows because it's a cat. That's what cats do. Okay. But I think it's good to state both of these, and it's very important in philosophy to have both of these in mind, right? But sometimes the great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, sometimes they'll speak, you know, this is being encircling rather than definition of full sense. Sometimes they'll say it's a definition by effect rather than by cause, right? Okay, so when Thomas talks about the definition of the good, the first definition of the good is what all desire. He usually point out this is a definition by effect, right? Rather than by cause. No? Okay? So sometimes one distinction is more appropriate to use than the other, right? But they're very similar, these two distinctions. Huh? Do you see that?
A question, so the definition by cause and effect, this is really the third type of definition of a thing?
No, this is we have two distinctions here, definitions of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is into definition in the full sense and encircling, right?
Right.
And definition in the full sense could just keep the word definition if you wanted to, and then call the other encircling. The other distinction is between definition by cause and by effect.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost the same distinction, right?
Uh-huh.
Because the property, in a way, is an effect of the species-making differences. Huh?
Okay.
And the species-making differences are what make it to be what it is, so like the cause, right?
Okay.
But it's stated a little bit differently, the distinction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's good to have both ones in mind because it's more natural, I think, if you define the good as what all desire, to not ask, is that a definition in the full sense or encircling?
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't, some of these other languages, but it's more natural to use the other language here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Okay.
Is the second, would it be any way broader than the first, or would they be like exactly the same?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, in explaining the first distinction there, you eventually got down to the names, right? Now, okay, so the emphasis is upon the speech, and the speech is composed of names. What are the names in the definition, right? And you might have a genus in both cases, but in one case you complete it with the species making differences. In the other case you have something more like a property or something that follows upon nature, right? More like another kind of name, right? But here you're not so much emphasizing name, but cause and effect. Huh? Okay.
But if you did have a definition by clause, I can't think of an example, but if you did, that would be a definition in the full sense, though.
Yeah. When I define marriage, for example, right? I define marriage as a stable union of a man and woman by mutual choice for the sake of children. And when you study the causes, you found there are 4 kinds of causes. And this definition of marriage, I have all 4 causes. Okay. Or the definition has sacrament, like when I was a child. Huh? An outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace, right? To give grace is the cause in the sense of end or purpose. Instituted by Christ is the cause in the sense of the mover or maker, right? Sign is more the cause in the sense of form, right? And outward, if you refer to the sensible matter, matter in the form of a sacrament, is the matter. So there you have a definition by cause. Huh? Okay. page 4, I think we've touched upon that enough. The reason why the definition by effect very often comes before the definition by cause. And the reason why the encircling always comes before the definition in the full sense, if you need both of them, right? But notice the reasons we gave are not so much identical here, right? Here we said that the effect is more known to us usually than the cause. So we define by cause before effect, right? Here I said we know things in an outward way before inwardly. Therefore we tend to encircle before we bring out fully what the thing is. Or we know things in a confused way before we know them distinctly, right? You see the difference there in the way I explain why that is so, right? Why the orders of that sort corresponds to the somewhat different, right? But what stands out in it, right? I mean, here you say definition by cause, definition by effect. Why do we define these things by effect before by cause? What stands out is, well, the effects are more known to us, usually than the cause, right? They're more sensible. When you say, why do you encircle a thing rather than get inside and penetrate? Well, you know things in an outward way before you know them inwardly, right? Okay. Or you know them in an indistinct way, before you really bring out distinctly what they are. Okay?
This question, I think in Greek we have this word to define orizo, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which has its root in this about these boundary markers that they've set up around the property, which seems to be closer to the second notion of encircling.
Well, I would say it goes back to the broad word itself, definition, right?
Okay.
You know, all these are definitions in some sense, right? And definition comes from the Latin word finis, in the sense of limit or boundary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, in Greek, sometimes you'll see the Greek word will be horos, which is exactly like limit.
Exactly. Right.
And sometimes you see the word in Aristotle horismos, okay? Very close to our word horizon.
Oh.
Horizon is that line that separates the sky from the earth, right?
Okay.
And originally these things, are taken in even in farming, right? If I put a fence around my property, I define my property, right? And I should, in that fence include only my property, but all of my property, right? But none of my neighbor's property, right? And then we speak of the city limits, right, and so on. And then the idea of limits is a very precise thing, right? So if you have the limits of, let's say, Worcester down here, the city limits of Worcester should contain the whole Worcester, right?
Right.
But none of any of the other towns around there, right? The limits of the state of Massachusetts, right? Should take in the whole of Massachusetts, but none of Connecticut or Maine or these other states around there, New Hampshire. And so you could say the definition, the logician will say, is convertible speech. Okay? It's not the whole meaning of definition, but a definition must be what? Convertible speech. Now, what does that mean? Well, convertible is a equivocal word, right? You can buy a car, it's convertible, right? Okay. But in logic, when you speak of two things as being convertible, A and B, for example, if every A is B and every B is A, then A and B are what? Convertible. Yeah, that's what it means, right? Okay. So a definition and what it's defining should be what? Convertible, right? Okay. So if, say, equilateral and right-angled, quadrilateral is in fact the definition of square, then both, every square should be a what? Equilateral and right-angled quadrilateral, and vice versa. Every equilateral and right-angled quadrilateral should be a what? Square, right? Okay. And sometimes you'll see Socrates or somebody will be turning around when someone proposes as a definition, right? And it's not convertible, then it doesn't fulfill the first condition, you might say, the definition that is suggested by the very name itself, right? Okay. I ask students in the love and friendship class, what is love? And they say, what's an emotion? Well, I don't think you want to say about that. But maybe there's one love that is an emotion, right? I say, but so is anger, so is fear, right? So even if every love is an emotion, which is not true, but even if that were true, if every love is an emotion, not every emotion would be what? Love, yeah. So we haven't defined it yet, huh? See? I think usually an example of chair, I ask a student, what is a chair? And they'll say, well, something to sit on, or a piece of furniture to sit on. I say, well, every chair is something to sit on. But is everything to sit upon a chair? You got a bench, maybe, or a sofa, or you got a saddle on the horse, and so on, right? See? So you can't turn around. So that's not a definition of square, right? And so even something as familiar as, a chair. So even something as familiar as a chair is hard to define right off the bat. Huh? See? You start to add differences, right? You say, well, a chair is something to sit on for one person or one adult, right? Okay. Well, is that convertible, see? Because maybe the saddle is for one person to sit on too, right? See? And maybe a stool is for one person to sit on. It's not really a chair, right? But then you say something for one person to sit upon that has legs and a back or something like that, right? And then you might be arriving at convertible speech, right? See? Okay. So, and Aristotle talks about defining in the second book of the Posterior Analytics. He talks about how you have to keep on adding differences until the speech is what? Convertible, right? Huh? Okay. So there we have a little bit of the origin of the word definition there. Huh? Now, in page 5, we meet a third distinction, but quite different from the first two, right? Okay? It's a different kind of distinction. Huh? And it's a distinction based now upon the thing being what? Defined. Huh? Okay? By the first two distinctions were how we define the thing, right? By cause or by effect, right? By difference or by property and so on, right? But now we're talking about things that are so different in the kind of thing they are that you can't define them in the same way at all. Okay? Now the fundamental distinction is the one that we meet in the categories of Aristotle between substance and accident. Huh? Now let's recall a little bit that distinction there. And why they have to be defined differently. And we'll see that in comparison here with that word definition again. A man, for example, or a dog, these are examples of a substance, right? A thing that exists, right? But not in another is in a subject, right? But you take the health of the man, let's say, or the health of the dog. And that's not something that exists by itself, is it? So if you had a man and a dog in this room, you could leave the man in here and put the dog in the next room, right? Or leave the dog in here and put the man in the next room, right? But if you have a healthy man in this room, you can't put the man in one room and his health in the next room, right? Because the health exists only in what? The man, right? Okay. So health is an example of what they call an accident as opposed to a substance. Okay. And substance comes from those Latin words to stand under. That's why it has that name, right? It stands under the accident. So the accident comes from the Latin word to happen to something, right? So it happens to something else. So the kind of thing that an accident is really quite different from a substance. Huh? The substance is something complete in itself, and the accident is really something of another, right? Okay? An accident something of another, right? Maybe that in which it exists. Huh? Right, the man and the dog is not something in another, right? It's in a subject. So you can define the man and the dog by itself, but you can't really define health by itself because it isn't something by itself. It's something of another. So you have to define health as something of another. So without trying to be very profound, you might define health as something like the good condition or good disposition of the body. Okay? Sickness would be a bad disposition of the body, right? So you have to define it as something of another because of the kind of thing it is. It is not a thing in its own right or by itself. It's something of another. It's not something complete. Or the man and the dog is something in itself complete. Huh? Now, in a way, the definition of an accident here almost seems to go against the meaning of the word definition. Because the word definition comes from the word limit, right? And as we said, in the limits of my field, or the limits of the city of Worcester, there shouldn't be contained anything besides Worcester, or my land, right? But in the definition of an accident, you have to bring in something other. You have to go to the definition. Right? Like here, I bring in the body, which is not health, right? Something else. The body is something in the genus of substance. Huh? So in the 7th book of Wisdom, Aristotle says that either there's no definition of accident, right? Because you bring in something other than what you're defining, right? You seem to go against that limit. Or you have definition in a secondary what? Sense, right? Okay. So the distinction between substance and accident is where we first see distinction between something that can be defined by itself and something that has to be defined as something of another, right? You have to say what it is of another. Okay. Sometimes when Thomas talks about wisdom, right? You know, human wisdom, he'll say it's the highest or the greatest perfection of reason. Okay. Now, all reason's knowledge is a perfection of reason, right? But wisdom is the highest or the greatest perfection of reason. And that's not yet a complete, understanding what wisdom is. But notice how you're starting to define wisdom as something of what? Another. Yeah, something of reason, right? Okay. It's a what? It's perfection of reason, right? Well, so is geometry, right? But wisdom is the highest or the greatest perfection there is of wisdom. Huh? Well, maybe you can't really know wisdom without knowing that it's something of reason. And we looked at the premium, right, to wisdom, right? And remember the 6 attributes of the wise man. He orders and directs others, right? Well, if you recall in the premium to the Nicomachean Ethics, Thomas quotes that from the premium of Aristotle to wisdom. And he gives us a reason for it, right? That wisdom is the highest perfection of reason, and it's proper to reason to what? To order things, yeah. If you go back to the definition of reason, which is, the first definition is the one given by Shakespeare. It's the ability for a large discourse looking before and after. Before and after is a definition of order. So if wisdom is the highest perfection of reason, then the wise man most of all will see order, and most of all be ordered to order direct, right? So you can't really understand what wisdom is fully, human wisdom anyway, right? Without understanding reason, right? Because wisdom is not something by itself, right? It's something of reason, right? Okay. And in general, you can say reasoned out knowledge is something of reason. Okay. When we take up love, and love is really something of the heart. Now, desire is something of the heart too, right? The heart desires, the heart loves, and so on. But just like wisdom is something of reason, love is something of the heart. So if you want to see what love is, you have to say what it is of the what? Heart. Huh? And the basic notion is that love is the conformity or agreement of the heart with its object. That's really what it is. And once the heart is conformed to an object and agreement with the object, then if you don't have the object, then you have this desire whereby you try to acquire it, right? Or if you acquire it, then you have delight or joy or pleasure, right? You see? So you can't really know what love is unless you know what it is of the heart. Love or liking, is conformity of the heart with its object, right? And desire or wanting is the heart seeking of an object, right? And joy or delight or pleasure is the heart resting in that object once it's acquired or possessed. So this is an extremely important distinction here, between the definition of a substance, the definition of an accident. But this distinction can be understood more broadly than just substance and accident, right? Okay? And that is the distinction between something that can be defined by itself, right? And something that must be defined as something of another, right? Okay. And if we have a chance sometime to study about the human soul, right? The human soul, now, is not an accident, right? But it's actually what they call substantial form. But it's something of another. You can't define the human soul by itself. You have to define it as something of another. And so Aristotle finally, approaches the definition after the Dialectic of Book 1. He starts to approach it in the second book. He gives 6 divisions, right? And as Thomas explains, 3 divisions are on the side of the soul itself, and 3 on the side of that of which the soul is something. Okay. Just like if I was going to define wisdom, I might say, well, we've got to talk about what reason is, right? Let's see some things about that, and then what wisdom is of reason. We have to say some things about that. Okay? So this is an extremely important distinction, but notice it's a much different distinction than the first 2, right? The first 2, in a way, corresponded to each other, right? Okay? And they're really a distinction by the way you're defining the thing and how perfectly you're defining it, right? Are you defining it by difference or by property? Are you defining it by cause or by effect, right? But here you have things that are so different that they have to, have almost a different meaning of the definition, right? One is defined by itself, and the other is defined as something of another, because it is something of another, right? Okay? And that's a good sign of the fact that you can't separate logic entirely from things, like the modern logicians try to do in symbolic or mathematical logic, right? They want a purely formal logic nothing to do with things. Forgetting that the purpose of logic is to help you know things, right? And I want to know both man and health, right? I want to know, the soul, right? I want to know wisdom as well as reason, right? And so you have to take into account the fact that the kind of definition you have of a substance and accident cannot be the same kind of definition. One must be what? Must bring in something other than what you're defining, which might seem at first contrary to definition. Well, it is contrary to definition in the full sense where you have a definition of a substance. Okay? Aristotle, I mentioned there when we were talking about the categories, that instead of calling the first category substance in the topics, he calls it what it is. Because that's the fundamental meaning of what it is. Huh? But in some way, health is what it is too. The more fundamental, you say health is how you are. How are you today? Well, I'm kind of sick, right? Healthy or whatever it is, right? But in some sense, you can ask the question, what about health, right? Okay. As Aristotle says, healthy seems more real than health, right? Because healthy brings out the fact this is something of another, right? By health seems like they're talking about itself, Okay. Wise is something more real than what? Wisdom.
So is wisdom then, is that like an accident of an accident? Something of an accident?
I say in general, we're saying it's something of another, right? Huh?
Yeah.
So you can't really understand wisdom without understanding something other than wisdom, namely reason. You can't really understand health without understanding something other than health. Is the glass suitable for drinking red wine? No. And is the mug suitable for drinking red wine? No. You want a glass that's shaped like this, right? Kind of tulip-like, So you can, put a little bit of wine in there and swish it around and sniff it, right? Right? Okay. So notice there are some differences among liquids, right? Like the wine and the coffee or tea, right? And the water, right? Where he's got to know something about what people are going to eat things in, or use these things to drink. Okay? Other things, the distinction is kind of irrelevant, right? So maybe hot chocolate and coffee could be drunk out of the same what? Mug, right? Okay. I like a clear mug for my tea because I can see the beautiful color of the tea, right? But that's unnecessary with coffee because you can have good color. Okay. But I see the distinction between the teacup or the tea mug or the coffee mug and the glass that doesn't have any handles, right? That's a distinction that's very important, isn't it? Okay. So, the difference, say, between the definition of square and the definition of circle, logician has nothing to say about that, right? Just the geometry talks about the definition of circle and the definition of square, distinguishes between them, right? Because they're not really a different kind of definition, are they, right? Okay. But when you define something as something of another, right, and define something else by itself, right, to be a different kind of definition, you can't use the same kind of definition. And that kind of distinction would be relevant to the what? Yeah, see. Okay. You see the comparison I'm making, right? The glass there and the mug are tools for what? Drinking, right? Definition is a tool for what? Understanding what a thing is. And some distinctions are relevant, right? Among things you drink with, right? The mug and the glass, right? Others are relevant to that, right? Okay. But here's a distinction where you really need a different kind of what? Definition to define health and to define man. Okay. It's like you need a different kind of receptacle here, right? To drink coffee than to drink water, right? Do you see that? Okay. So you can't fully separate logic from things. Huh? In fact, the distinction between definition by cause and definition by effect. That's something to do with things, right? Cause and effect is a distinction in things, right? And so definition by cause, definition by effect, you have to know what you're doing, right? As I was trying to indicate, the most basic things, like the definition of good, right? The whole of ethics and the whole of what you say about human life and action depends upon understanding what good and bad are, right? And what kind of definition you have here of the good, right? So those distinctions are very relevant, huh? If logic is going to be useful for knowing things, huh? I don't know, one of the symbolic logicians at the University of Minnesota told one of my friends here in Minnesota that symbolic logic is useless for knowing things. It was a moment of honesty or what? No, we go quite that far, but some truth to his remark. Okay. Now, in the next section here, on page 6 and 7 here, it's not enough for the logician to know what a definition is, and even to know the kinds of definitions. He has to know that. But he also has to know how to find a definition, right? Or how to arrive at a definition. And one thing you have to know when you learn the ways that we arrive at a definition, it's useful to know these ways, and you have to follow these ways. But logic is not a substitute for thinking. Huh? You still have to think when you use these ways. Huh? And it's not automatic in the way that adding or subtracting or multiplying or dividing becomes kind of what? Automatic, right? Huh? Okay. And I find that myself, even if I'm correcting papers or something like that, I have to think a little bit about whether the student has said something or not, right? When it comes time to figure out the averages, we've got a bunch of numbers there, well, it's just a mechanical thing, right? You can do it automatically, right? But in defining, you have to do a lot of what? Thinking, right? And a definition, as they say, like the definition of motion, or the definition of the soul, or the definition of eternity, definition of time, these are a major work of reason, huh? Okay? Now, I like to use a military kind of metaphor here to approach the question of how you investigate a definition. Plato and Aristotle often compared defining to hunting, right? And you see this in the dialogue of Plato, we're trying to hunt down the things trying to escape from us, right? And Aristotle speaks of, the postanalytics use the word theroue, right? Which comes from the word for a beast, right? You're hunting down the beast that's trying to escape you. Okay? Well, I use a slightly different metaphor, but hunting and warfare are similar, right? And I say you've got the enemy castle here. You want to take the enemy castle here, huh? Okay, it's a little image here to get you thinking, right? Okay. Now, there's three ways of attacking that castle, right? Which is guarding what it is, right? Okay. You can attack it from the side, right? Knock down the walls, right? Battering ram, right? Okay. Or you can dig underneath it and try to undermine it, right? Okay. You read about these tunnels that the North Koreans have dug, to read something, huh? Of course the Vietnamese have done it too, but right underneath living in the enemy territory. Really tremendous, huh? Or if you've got an airplane or if you've got a catapult, you can what? Okay. And so you'll see that even in the old castle there, they would try to undermine it, right? Dig holes, right? And the enemy seems to start their own hole and move halfway down the passage and you got a nasty exchange down there. Okay? But then you shoot flaming things and then so on. And you try to knock the walls down and so on. Okay. Now, let's drop the metaphor here, right? For logical terms, right? What do these three correspond to, huh? Yeah. But notice how when we talk about the more universal and the less universal, right? We tend to what? Put the more universal above the what? Less universal, right? Okay? So we'd say that under animal comes man and dog and cat and horse. And under, quadrilateral comes square and oblong and so on, right? Okay? There's a reason why we do that, right? Okay? But notice even the definition there of species in general, we said it's the name of a particular kind of thing, right? Placed under a what? Genus, right? Okay. And notice how we tend to say the more universal, the less universal, right? Or more apt to say man is an animal than an animal is a man. So we can say some animals are man, but we tend to say the more universal, the less universal. And they call the thing of which something is said the subject, remember? And then that which is said of it, the predicate. And subject means sub, under, right? Okay. So we tend to put the more universal above the what? Less universal, right? Okay. That's why they speak of Porphyry's tree, right? Because you divide the more universal, it spreads out like a tree. Huh? One time at a Christmas party there, they gave the magician a Porphyry's tree, right? That was a joke, right? But they call it Porphyry's tree, huh? Because when you divide, it spreads out like a Christmas tree, right? It's appropriate for Christmas time. So, could attack it from above, meaning start off with something more universal than what you're going to define, right? Okay. Or you could attack it from below and start off with something less universal, okay, or even singular, right? Okay. Or you attack it from the side, and there would be something what? Yeah. Okay. So you can, we're talking first here about where you begin to investigate definition, right? And you have 3 places where you might begin, right? But notice this is a division again into 3. You know how most distinctions are into 2 or 3. In fact, we'll make the rule here in another page or so. But that seems to be all there is, right? More, less, and equal, right? What else is there, right? But it's in terms of something logical, right? Because the distinction between the universal and the more universal and the less universal and so on, things are universal only in the mind, only in reason, right? So this is a distinction that fits reason, right? Now, let's be more precise here. If you start off with something more universal, you're probably starting off with something like a what? Genus, right? If you start with something less universal, right? Okay, or singular, you're starting with what? Examples of the thing, right? Okay. Now, most often in the dialogues of Plato, when Socrates asks somebody what is something, they'll begin by giving what? Examples, right? And a child will always do this, right? If you ask a child, what is a circle? He'll say, well, that's a circle, right? He'll point to the clock or something that is a circle, right? Okay. But a lot of times in class, if you ask somebody, what is a dog? They'll say, well, dog is a what? Animal, right? They'll start with something more general, right? Something that's true, right? But obviously it's not a definition of dog, right? Ask them, what is love? They say it's emotion, right? Well, maybe there is one kind of love that is an emotion, right? The emotion, even of that kind of love, is a what? A genus, right? Huh? Okay? So those are the 2 very common places where people begin. I asked them, what is a sonnet? You know, Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, right? What's a sonnet? And they'll say, what's a poem, right? Okay? So very often they'll start with, you know, the genus, right? But more often they'll start with the examples, right? Now, if you start with something equally universal, what would you be starting from?
Property.
It could be a property or a proper effect, right? Okay. Property or a proper effect. So there's 3 places where a man might begin to investigate what something is, right? Okay. In fact, he does, we find, you know, that they spontaneously they will begin with one at these or the other, right? Okay. What is a comedy? Huh? Well, it's a play that makes you laugh, right? Okay. Well, in a way, you're starting with something equally universal, right? Huh? Okay. What is a dog? It's an animal, they'll say. That's in class, I get animal, right away. Yeah. What's a chair? Something to sit on. Well, that's again like a genus, right? There are many things to sit upon, and a chair is one particular kind of thing to sit on, right? But there are benches and sofas and all kinds of things. And when Socrates asks, you know, meaning what virtue is, or Euthyphro what piety is, or he asks Theaetetus what episteme or science is, the guy can go with examples first, right? Okay. So 3 places to begin, right? Okay. Now, is the road from each of those beginnings the same, or do you have a different road to get to the definition of each of those starting points?
Different road.
Yeah. Now, if you begin with examples, what is the road you take to the definition? And suppose I wanted to define, what a Shakespearean sonnet is, right? And so I get a book of Shakespearean sonnets, and I've got 154 examples of the sonnet, right? Okay. Now, how do you go from those examples to the definition of sonnet?
You would compare them to find what is common.
Yeah, you compare the sonnets, right? And separate out what they have in common, right? And leave aside their what? Differences, right? Okay. Now notice, that way is simple enough to say, the way you proceed. It would take, in practice, a long time to separate out everything that the 154 sonnets have in common, right? And I might notice at first, well, they seem to have somewhat the same length. And if I examine more carefully, this one's got actually 14 lines in it, yeah. And this one's got 14 lines, and they all have 14 lines, right? Okay. But is that all they have in common? See? And as I read them, I might begin to see where there seems to be some kind of, meter here, and there seems to be some kind of what? Rhyme, right? I said, well, look, the first line and the third line rhyme in this one, and the second and the fourth rhyme, right? I'm seeing over here, the first and the third, and the second and the fourth, right? And then the fifth and the seventh, and the sixth and the eighth rhyme, right? And then the what? They seem to alternate the rhyme, right? And then the ninth and the 11th, and the 10th and the 12th rhyme. Then there's two lines at the end, but they both rhyme, right? See? So it kind of falls into what they call three quatrains, right? With alternate rhyming, and it's completed by a rhyming couplet, right? Okay. But as you also think of what Shakespeare's doing there, he's making a likeness of what? Some thought or feeling, right? Okay. So eventually I write at my definition of a Shakespearean sonnet, which is that it's a likeness of thought and feeling, right? In 14 lines of iambic pentameter, divided into three quatrains with alternate rhyming, and completed by rhyming couplet. See? But I haven't arrived at that definition all at once, right? You have to read the sonnets and compare them, and other people maybe help you with it too, right? Okay. You see that? If someone asks you what is a definition, right? So let's take some easy definitions here, and you might go to Euclid, right? And you've got a bunch of definitions there at the beginning, right? And then you start to see, if you examine these definitions, that they have what? Something like a genus, right? And then they have these what? Differences, right? Okay? So you might arrive at the idea that definition is speech composed of the genus and differences, right? Okay? But notice you get this by comparing definitions, right? Okay? You see the idea? So basically, if you start off with examples of a thing, and they can be, species would be examples of the genus, right? Like man and dog and cat and horse would be examples of animals, right? Or individuals, right? This man and this man, this kind of examples of man, right? Okay. But in both cases, you would compare the examples, separate out what they have in common, and leave aside the differences, right? That's basically the way you proceed, right? Okay. Now, if you start from the more universal, from the contrary place now, right? Then you start with something one. You don't have many examples. You have something one, right? The dog is an animal, right? If I started with the sonnet, right? I say well, the sonnet is a poem, right? Okay. Now, how would you go from the more universal down to the species? How would you proceed there? By dividing, right? You divide by differences, right? And then you see under which difference the thing to be defined comes, right? Then you add that difference to the genus, and if that speech resulting is convertible, you might say, well, now I've got a kind of definition of the thing, right? If it's not, I've got to have another division and add another difference, right? Okay. So, if I begin, so you say, what is a square? And somebody says, what's a quadrilateral, right? And I might say, well, how do you divide quadrilaterals, right? And you say, well, parallelogram, trapezium, right? And which is the square? Well, it has opposite sides and angles equal, it seems, right? So it's a parallelogram, right? And then I say, well, it can be right angled or even obtuse angle. Okay? Which is this? It's right angled, right? Huh? Okay? But now, is that convertible with square yet? Huh? A right angled quadrilateral, right? So it's not convertible yet with square, right? Okay? So notice, this doesn't substitute for thinking. You get a lot of thinking, right? You see? You've got to do a lot of comparison down here of the examples. Here you've got to see what differences are appropriate for dividing this sort of a genus, right? And you've got to think about which difference does it come under, right? And then you have to see, is the speech resulting from adding that difference to the genus convertible or not, right? So it's a major work to define, right? I can't just go automatically from here to there like I can with adding up a number of figures, right? So I can have a little adding machine I want to, just to do quickly or something, right? But here I can't get a little machine to go from the genus down to difference, right? You see that, huh? So you have two distinct beginnings, in a way contrary, right? One is above and one is below. And above you start with something one, and when you start below you start from many, right? But the way of getting from the one to the definition or from the many to the definition are quite distinct, right? The many you have to compare, right? And separate out what they have in common. And the more universal you have to divide, right? Aristotle talks about these two ways in the second book of the Posterior Analytics, because he's talking about demonstration in that book. And definition is the beginning of demonstration. That's why Euclid starts with definitions. And so he talks about how you get the beginning of demonstration, right? Okay? And he talks about these two different ways. And one way is more proportion to us, right? The other way is a little more rigorous, but okay. And he has some likeness to the distinction later on in the third act there between syllogism and what? Induction, right? Because in induction you go from many particular statements to a general statement, right? By the syllogism you start out with something general and you deduce something from it. Right? So that's a very fundamental distinction. But induction comes first for us because it starts from the singular, which is sensible. And the examples are sensible or closer to the senses. Okay? Now, if you start from something equally universal, like it can be a property or a proper effect, or it could be an encircling even, right? Okay. Do you have another, what road did you take to get in there?
Reasoning.
Yeah, reasoning, right? Okay. Now, take my example here because I like to kill two birds with one stone. Suppose someone asked me, what is wisdom? Okay. And I might say, well, my starting point is wisdom is the best knowledge. Huh? Now, wisdom is the best knowledge, and the best knowledge is wisdom. They're like, the same thing, right? Okay. It's a kind of outward knowledge here, right? And I want to reason inwardly to what wisdom is, right? Okay. So, I'm going to have to do a lot of thinking about this, right? Might say, for example, what does best mean? Well, best means better than all the rest, right? Okay, you all know what best means, right? Okay. If I say so-and-so is my best student, what do I mean? Better than all the rest, right? This is our best model, the salesman says, right? It's supposed to be better than all the rest, right? This is the best cut of meat we have, right? Better than all the rest. Huh? So now I have to stop and think, and I say, if this is a knowledge that's better than all the rest, why is one knowledge better than another? have to do a lot of thinking, right? Huh? In the beginning of the 3 books on the soul, Aristotle talks about how good the knowledge is of the soul. And he begins by saying that one knowledge is better than another if it's about a better thing, or if it's more certain. Huh? Okay. So it's better to what? Smell a rose than to smell the what? Things I want to mention here. Okay? It's better to hear the music of Mozart than to hear noise, right? It's better to see a beautiful painting, right? Than to see the ash can or something, right? Okay. Now, in the parts of animals, Aristotle points out, though, that the criterion of being about a better thing is more important than being more certain, right? It's better to know a better thing, even imperfectly, than to know a lesser thing, what? Perfectly, right? It's more essential to knowledge what it is that you're knowing. So, after a lot of thinking, I might say that knowledge of a better thing is better what? Knowledge, right? Okay. Notice one knowledge differs from another chiefly by what? What it's a knowledge of, right? Okay? Like we said before when we talked about before and after. What comes before seeing it before and after?
Looking?
Yeah, you have to see a distinction before you can see a before and after, right? Okay? So before you can see that one knowledge is before another in the sense of being better, right, you have to see a distinction, right? And the fundamental distinction between one knowledge and another is what's a knowledge of, right? Okay? So, you figure out then that knowledge of a better thing is better what? Knowledge, right? Okay? Now if that's true, then the best knowledge must be what?
Knowledge of the best thing.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, if you wanted to, I could put this in the form of a if-then syllogism, what they call conditional hypothetical syllogism. If knowledge of a better thing is better knowledge, then knowledge of the what?
Best thing.
Is the best knowledge. Okay? Okay. But knowledge of a better thing is better knowledge, right? In fact, I might show that by the ash can and the beautiful painting of the sunset or something, right? And the smelling the rose and smelling things that are mentionable. And hearing music and hearing noise and so on, right? Huh? You start to see inductively, right? That knowledge of a better thing is better knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Okay? And then you reason from that knowledge, the best knowledge must be then the knowledge of what? The best thing, right? Huh? Okay? So, that's what I'm doing here now. Basically, I'm constructing a syllogism here. I'm saying wisdom is the best knowledge. The best knowledge is a knowledge of the best thing. Okay? Now, if I know what the best thing is, I can what? Go further, right? See? Now I might know that the best thing is God, let's say, right? Huh? Okay? Or I might believe this, right? Okay? So the best thing is God. Huh? Therefore, wisdom is the knowledge of what? God, yeah. See what I've done, right? I'm reasoning from the statements that wisdom is the best knowledge, and the best knowledge is the knowledge of the best thing, And the best thing is God. To wisdom is the knowledge of God, right? Okay. Now you read Galileo there, but probably more so would be Einstein. Huh? Einstein wanted to know the universe as a whole, right? So Einstein reasoning, right? Okay. Let me give another example of that. Very important. Suppose I say now that moral virtue is a praiseworthy quality, right? Now, how would I try to reason my way in? How would I try to get more inward knowledge of what virtue is, right? Well, I mean, say when a man sits down to eat or drink, huh? You know, what's praiseworthy? Eating too much and getting drunk and so on? No, that's praise, right? Huh? But what about these women, you know, they're suffering from anorexia or whatever it is? They're not eating enough, right? They're actually, what? Killing themselves, right? Huh? And I don't know much about women myself, but I mean, for this is a serious problem, right? You know, okay, the women are, you know. So, is it praiseworthy to eat more than you need or go to excess, you know? Or is it praiseworthy to eat less than you should? No. What is praised is in the what? Middle, right? Huh? Okay. So you add to this, what is praised is not the extreme, too much or too little, but what is praised is in the middle, right? Okay. Well, now I could syllogize that moral virtue is what? In the middle, right? Huh? Okay. This is only the beginning of reasoning out what moral virtue is, right? But you see what I'm doing? I'm going in by what? Reasoning, right? Huh? Okay. Now, as a matter of fact, you know, these three ways of proceeding, probably nobody would use just one of them, right? You might be attacking the fortress as they do in the military example, right? They don't just attack one of these ways, they're attacking them 3 different ways at the same time, right? And the enemy has a hard time resisting it, undermining him, breaking his walls down, and shooting flames or dropping bombs on him, right? It's pretty hard to resist, right? And so when I'm investigating what moral virtue is, I might be reasoning in this way, right? Okay. But I might also be looking at examples of moral virtue, right? You see? I might look at moderation there, which is in eating and drinking. And, you know, I always quote that famous remark of Teresa of Avila, right? Someone brought partridges up to the convent and she enjoyed them, you know, for dinner. And someone saw her enjoying them, right? And protested, and she says, penance is penance and partridge is partridge. So you can go to, you know, a defect, right? You know, and you don't want to waste this wonderful food, right? And who's that woman who was always fixing the specialty for St. Francis, you know? He was he was a very studious man, right? But he'd always be so thankful when she brought this, you know? And you have to understand, you know, if a woman thinks you really like particular food and she makes it, you know, and goes out of her way to make this for you, you should receive it with what? Open arms and enjoy it, right? You know, you shouldn't not enjoy the food because, you know, it's pleasurable, right? So moderation, you might say, you know, but most people go to the opposite thing, right? Eat too much, you drink too much, and so on. Huh? Okay. But then you take what they call liberality or generosity, and you say, well, is that also in between 2 extremes? Huh? Well, it's in between the stingy man, right, who doesn't spend enough, right? And then there's the man who's what? Extravagant, right? Huh? Okay. So I like to have wine with my dinner, but if I go out and buy a $50 bottle of wine, and say, well, it's, you know, so then professors are actually buying $50 bottles of wine, right? Okay. that would be what? Extravagant for me, right? Huh? Okay. But now suppose it's our anniversary, and I take her out to McDonald's. Well, if that's all I can afford, that's okay. I mean, you see. So, liberality is spending neither more nor less than you should for this event, right? Okay. See. So, when my daughter gets married, I'm going to spend a lot more money, or I just spend a lot more money than if I'm, taking my family out to dinner or something, right? Okay. You expect to pay a lot, your father, right? Or the bride, huh? Okay. But for this occasion, right? I remember one time reading a newspaper, I should have cut it out years ago, some Maharaja in India, right? And he's extremely wealthy, right? And his daughter or somebody's getting married, and he decided to give a donation to the local charity, right? And he gave them like $20, something like that. Like millionaire, billionaire. And just a little, it seems like, it's an example of stinginess, right? Inappropriate for him, right? To give so small a gift, to celebrate this occasion, He's just, so pithy, So I might, what Aristotle does in the second book, if you look at the second book of Nicomachean Ethics, he's investigating what moral virtue is, right? And partly he's reasoning, that what is praised is the man who hits the golden mean, right? Mm-hmm. And but then he's looking at the particular virtues and seeing what they have in common, right? And he shows that each of them is a virtue in the middle, right? Okay. But he also investigates it starting off from what quality habit is, right? And he starts to divide it, right? So he's actually attacking moral virtue in maybe all three of those ways, right? Okay. But nevertheless, you can distinguish those three ways, if you use them, separately or together, right? Or one after the other, right? Until the thing finally gives way and says, okay, I surrender, right? You've got the fortress, right? You've got the what it is, right? Okay. But in none of these, as I say, is it automatic or mechanic. See, with symbolic logic, or mathematical logic, as we call it in some cases, they were trying to assimilate logic to calculation, right? And as Leibniz said, some of the early founders of it, Leibniz said, well, when men disagree, we'll sit down, let's calculate, and then that's simple to resolve. But thinking is not that simple, right? So it never becomes automatic, like counting or adding, subtracting, multiplying. You still have to think, right? So some people look, logic is going to be a substitute for thinking. It's a help to thinking, right? So, but it's difficult to understand what something is, right? And where do you begin to investigate what something is? Well, one way of dividing it, logically, is to start with something above or universal, or below or equally universal. And then what are you starting from, in fact? When you start in one of those places, the genus or examples, or property or convertible, a circlet or something of that sort. And then you have three different ways of going from each of those beginnings. Okay.
Was it the error there that you mentioned that people want to try to calculate? Isn't that they don't get the distinction between reason and calculating? That's
Yeah, defining is so much different from counting, right? Yeah. Counting is something I can do just like that, Yeah. But defining, I got to stop and do a lot of thinking, right?
Yeah.
If I want to count the people in here, or count the books in here, or count the chairs in here, right? Yeah. Right away, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But defining is not like that, huh?
Okay. So counting is defining is like counting.
And the Greeks had two arts. One was called logike, where you get the word logic, right? And this is the art of defining and reasoning. And then you had logistike, right? Where you get the word logistic, but has a different meaning, logistic. And that was the art of counting and calculating. So as a child, you learn something of the art of counting and calculating. I learned in grade school how to count and how to add and subtract and multiply and divide, right? But I didn't learn logic until I was a senior in high school, and my buddy was in college, and he started to teach me the logic course. Okay? So it's quite different art, huh? But the mathematical logic was an attempt in a way to bring these two together, assimilate one to the other. There's a likeness of the two. In both cases, the reason has a discourse, right? But counting is really the first step before you calculate, right? You got to have some numbers by counting before you can add or subtract, multiply or divide. And defining is a starting point for the most rigorous reasoning. Huh? But counting people doesn't tell me what a man is, right? And telling me what a man is doesn't tell me how many men there are. So we help one question the other, right? You have to be able to recognize men to count them, but you don't really have to, know what man is and what reason is like we did for the definition. But if I define man as an animal with reason, that doesn't tell me how many men are here.
Then that it's having to deal with accident instead of substance, so that if it has to do with quantity, that would be one of my confusion something there.
No, the question is, it's a different question. So what is a man, and how many men are there?
Right. Wasn't the first you're doing substance, and then the second one an accident?
Well, there's something accidental there, yeah. But look at the question as being a different kind of question, right? Okay. What is water, and how much water is there in the world, right?
The other thing I was wondering about, I wonder, do we need to, it's important to go through the different senses of reason? Because it seems like there's different senses of reason for, as in ratio.
Mm-hmm.
I came upon this because I was looking at, for instance, in St. Thomas and the Summa on Providence, we had a question of predestination came up. So predestination, and then as well predestination is part of providence, and then the definition of providence. He speaks about ratio ordinance. It seemed like ratio had sort of a...
ratio has many more meanings,
Yeah.
I mean, if you take, let me give an example here.
Okay.
Of something that's, you say, reason is the ability to give a reason. Okay? Is the word reason here univocal or equivocal here? Yeah. Because here reason means what? The ability that Shakespeare defined, right? Huh? Okay. So when you give a reason for something, you're in a way knowing one thing to another, right? So that's related to the ability for discourse, right? Okay. But this here is more like the object of this ability, right? Okay. Now, somebody asked students, is this a bad definition of reason, right? And sometimes I want to say it's a bad definition of reason because you're using the thing you're defining in the definition, right? Huh? But if you're not using the word in the same meaning, right? And you know the other meaning of the word reason, then this is not really defining something by itself. Okay? And you'll notice in some things, like you take the word taste, for example. Sometimes the word taste is the name of a sense, right? Okay. But we speak of the taste of the food, right? Well, taste in the sense of one of the five senses is the ability to sense the taste of things, right? Huh? Okay? And to some extent the word smell is like that, right? Smell something, okay? But we also use smell maybe for one of the five senses, right? Huh? And this is something like that, right? Huh? Here, huh? So you want to distinguish between those two senses, right? Huh? Okay. Now, when you speak of to reason, apart from the grammatical difference here, now it's the verb, infinitive. But notice here you're talking about the ability, here you're talking about the act, and here you're talking more about the object, right? Okay. So you want to distinguish those three, right? And reason gives a reason for a what? Statement, right? Okay. But there are more than one kind of reason that it gives. So sometimes I ask the students, what's the best reason you can give for a statement? What's the best reason? I give an example like this, and I say, here's an example in geometry. Straight lines intersect, right? Are these angles here equal? What would you say? Now, one reason for saying they're equal is they look like they're equal. Is that the best reason you can give for saying those angles will be always equal? Okay. Another reason might be some mechanically measure these two, right? Okay. That might tell you that these two are equal, but will they always be equal? No. You can measure hundreds of them and find it to be true. Kind of induction, right? Is that the best reason you can give for saying they're equal? No. Or you can say, well, Euclid says they're equal. Argument from authority, right? That's a reason to say that they're equal. Is that the best reason you can give? No. The best reason you can give for a statement, like that when straight lines intersect, these angles are equal, or in fact, these ones, the best reason you can give is the reason why it must be so. Okay? And this is what a demonstration is, huh? The reason why it must be so. Huh? When Aristotle defines demonstration, he defines it as a syllogism, making us know the cause, right? And that of which it is a cause, and that it cannot be otherwise. Huh? See, that's really, a demonstration involves the reason why it must be so, right? Now, the reason why it must be so is basically because the lines are what? Straight. And so, because the lines are straight, angle A and angle X must be what? Two right angles, huh? Or equal to two right angles, huh? Okay? So A plus X must equal two right angles, huh? And because this is a straight line, being a straight line, B plus X must equal two right angles, huh? And the rest is simply the obvious axioms that quantities equal to the same, equal to each other. Therefore, A plus X must equal B plus X. And then equal subtracting equals results are equal, right? But all of this follows because the lines intersecting are straight, right? Because they intersect are angles, but because the lines intersecting are straight, A plus X must equal to right angles, B plus X must equal to right angles. There's an early theorem in geometry that when a straight line meets a straight line, it makes two right angles, or angles equal to two right angles. That's pretty easy to see. But once you've seen that, then you see the reason why A and B must be equal, right? Okay. And that's the best reason you can possibly give, right? And but Plato had seen that even before Aristotle, right? He talks about that in Meno, right? He talks about the difference between knowledge in the strict sense and right opinion. Huh? Because when you have the right opinion, you're right too. And you're saying something true. See? Everybody says, in the case of knowledge, what you think is not only true, but it's tied down by the knowledge of the what? Cause, right? Okay. So the cause of these lines, these angles being equal, is the straightness of the lines. And the demonstrator, in that demonstration, Euclid shows that the reason why straight lines intersect these angles must be equal, right? He's given the reason why it must be so. That's the most perfect reason you can give. You can't always give that reason, you know, but that's the best reason you can give. That's the perfection of it. So if you define reason, right, as the ability to give the reason why it must be so, you're defining reason by the most perfect reason it can give, right? Okay. But of course, that's already involved in looking before and after, because that's a common sense of before, right? That the cause is before the effect, right? leads to the same thing, right? Kind of marvelous the way it does. Looking at Thomas there, he's talking about sacramental orders, right? Holy orders. And he says it's in reference to the what? Eucharist, right? Because that's the ultimate thing, right? You define something by the greatest thing it can do, right? Okay. And then he reasons that because the priest can what? Not say Mass, consecrate and so on, and therefore distribute, the Eucharist, then he has to have the ability to forgive sins, because without that someone would not be suitable to receive the Eucharist, right? Okay. But the ultimate thing is the Eucharist, right? That's the greatest of the sacraments. It's the end of all the other sacraments. All the other sacraments contain the power of Christ, but this alone contains Christ himself. So it's the end of the culmination. So the ultimate thing for reason, right, is to give the reason why it must be so, right? The ultimate thing is to look before and after in that sense. It's the cause before the effect, right? That's why I call that fifth sense that Aristotle gives after the four, the crowning sense, right now, the culmination of reason. Okay. We also use the word reason there when we say to reason for the name of the act, right? Now let's look a little bit at division here, right? We can get to the rule of 2 or 3, right? Who knows? Okay. Now, using now division here to refer to not the definition itself, but to divisions that are not a definition, right? Okay. And division in the strict sense is the distinction of the parts of some whole, right? Okay. Division is the distinction of the parts of some whole. So in logic, we want to distinguish at least two kinds of division, according to there being two kinds of wholes. Now, the one kind of whole, which is the original meaning of the word whole, they sometimes call it the integral whole. I like to call it the composed whole, right? You'll see both words. You have the integral or composed whole. And then, a second sense of whole, the universal whole. Now, in distinguishing and in a way defining these two kinds of whole, I use an affirmative and a negative part of my definition. And the two definitions are just the reverse. So the integral or composed whole is, as the word composed means, is put together from its parts. But it's not said of its parts. So the chair you're sitting on, right, is put together from the seat and the legs and the back and so on. But chair is not said of the seat and the legs. The leg is not a chair, right? The seat is not a chair, right? The back is not a chair. But put together, these make a chair, right? Okay. The word cat is put together from the letters C, A, and T, right? But the letter C is not the word cat. the letter A is not the word cat, right? And so on. But that put these together. A definition is a what? Integral composed whole, right? The genus is put together, the definition is put together from the genus and the differences, right? But the genus is not a definition. The difference is not a definition, right? But put together in a certain way, they are in form a definition, right? Now the universal whole is just the reverse, huh? It's said of its parts, meaning it's said of each one individually, right? But not composed of, not put together from them, huh? Okay? So quadrilateral is the universal whole. It's said of what? Square, oblong, rhombus, rhomboid, trapezium. But it's not composed of them, right? Okay? The animal's universal whole, said of man and dog, cat and horse, but it's not put together from them, right? Otherwise, when you say man is a animal, you say man is something composed of cat, dog, horse, elephant, and so on, right? It's observed, right? Okay? When you say square is a quadrilateral, it's not something composed of square, oblong, rhombus, rhomboid, and trapezium. Okay? So if you understand one of these definitions, the other one is just the what? Reverse, right? Okay? But the integral composed whole is the first meaning of the word whole. And the Greek word for genus, or for the general, comes from the Greek word for whole, right? And what comes under the whole we sometimes call the particular, but it's stuck apart, right? So you got these two kinds of wholes in every, what? Reasoned out knowledge, right? What I do when I explain this to students sometimes in college there, I'll go through all the sciences inductively, right? And you see that every one of them divides in both of these ways. Huh? Take, for example, grammar, right, which is the first science you learn in a way, right? Grammar is about the sentence. Huh? English grammar is about making sentences in English. And Greek grammar is about making sentences in Greek. Sentence is the subject of grammar reading. Now, what does he divide sentence into? Sometimes what they call the parts of speech, noun, verb, adjective, adverb, right? That's a division of an integral or composed whole into its parts, right? So, is the noun a sentence? No. Is the verb a sentence? No. But man walks, right? Composed of a noun and verb is a sentence, right? Okay. But then he divides sentence into what? Declarative sentence, maybe, right? Question, command, prayer, right? And each one of those is a sentence by itself, right? Okay. But it's not composed of these, is it? Sentence. Okay. Sentence is not composed of command, prayer, question, declaration, is it? No. But it's said of each one of these, right? Okay. So the grammarian divides in both ways, right? Okay. Does the geometry divide in both ways? Well, when Euclid divides the circle into two semicircles, is a semicircle a circle? No. When he divides a parallelogram into two triangles, right? The triangle parallelogram? No. That's a division of a whole into its parts, right? When you divide parallelogram into, let's say, square and oblong and rhombus and rhomboid, then you divide into universal whole. So he divides in both ways, and sometimes the same thing in both ways, right? Okay. If you go to chemistry and they talk about the atom, they might divide the atom into what? Proton, electron, neutron, and that's what kind of division? Yeah, the proton is not an atom, the electron is not an atom, right? But maybe an atom is composed of these, right? But when I divide atom, like you do in the periodic table, into the hydrogen atom and the nitrogen atom and oxygen atom and so on, then you have a universal whole, right? Okay. So the chemist divides in both ways, right? Okay. Does the biologist divide in both ways, huh? How does he divide tree? Well, shoots and roots and, what's in between the roots and the branches?
Trunk.
Trunk, yeah. See? Now, what kind of division is that of tree? Yeah, I think it divides tree into the broadleaf tree and the needle tree, right? That's this kind, right? Okay. Hopefully, yeah. A noun is not a statement, right? But an affirmation is a statement, and a negation is a statement, right? But a statement is not composed of affirmation and negation. Okay. And since, Locke is mixing up these two kinds of division when he's saying that triangle in general, it's what? All and none of these, right? It's species, huh? Like it's kind of, you run them all together, right? It's like, I get the idea of animal by taking a dog and a cat and a horse and so on, run them all together and they're all mixed up and that's animal. No, it's not that, right? You separate out what they have in common and you left aside their differences, huh? Now, let me clarify one more thing here about the words here we've used with the letter D here. You take the word distinction, which I use in my definition of what? Division. And division, and then the definition. Since a definition has parts, in a way you break up something into parts, right? You could say the definition in a way is a division, right? Okay? But not every division is a what? Definition. So division is more universal than what? Definition, right? Okay? So in the first chapter there of the physics, Aristotle speaks of a definition as diare, and it divides into parts, right? Okay? Now sometimes division and distinction, are used loosely to mean the same thing, right? But in the strict sense, only some divisions are, the strict use of the word division, are distinctions. Only some distinctions are divisions, but not vice versa. The division, in the strict sense, is like I define it there, the distinction of the parts of some whole. So you need a whole, really, right? In order to have a division, right? Okay? Right, distinction is the most universal, right? Okay, so every division is a distinction, but not every distinction is a what? Division, right? And sometimes I have talked here in the logic of the first act about those distinctions are not a division. But usually I, are temperate and I leave it to the consideration of the famous fallacies, right? Because they are based upon the most fundamental ones, upon how we're consider distinctions. Okay. And you'll see Thomas Aquinas say, sometimes use division, and distinction kind of interchangeably, but sometimes he's very careful about it, right? One place where he's very careful about is when he talks about the Trinity, right? You distinguish between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. You distinguish between the three of them, right? But is that a division? See? Well, he'll deny that this is a division, right? See? God is not divided into the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? But nevertheless, that would imply that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are somehow like a what? Part, right? In which case you'd be thinking of God as a composed whole, composed of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that would be a very serious mistake about the Trinity, right? Okay. But there is a real distinction between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, right? There's a real distinction in the Father and the Son, and then a real distinction in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit that proceeds from that, right? So, distinction is really broader in meaning than division, right? Every division is a distinction, but not every distinction is a division. And so, when you distinguish the senses of a word, like we did the word before a moment ago, right? Or as we did distinguish the sense of the word whole, is that really a division, or should it be called a distinction, but not a division?
distinction that don't make up a whole.
Or when you distinguish between the per se and the gratuitants, right? The as such and the accidental and so on. Or when you distinguish between the simply in some respect, right? There's certain distinctions that are very important in thinking. But they're not really divisions in the strict sense. You don't really have a part there in the strict, I mean the whole part in the strict sense. So the word wise. As I say, a lot of times we use the word division and distinction kind of interchangeably, because it's not somewhat the same thing,
Can you say what is a distinction?
Between them?
No, a distinction. What is it? Define a distinction. A division is a distinction. First.
Yeah. Well, basically, distinction. The basis of distinction really is opposition, right? You have to have some kind of opposition, so you have to go into a study of the four kinds of opposites, right?
To explain distinction.
Yeah. But in the case of division, you add something to that, right? The idea that what are being distinguished are really parts of some whole, right? Okay. So these are descending from the more universal to the less universal. You notice that how we mentioned before how distinction comes before order, right? When Aristotle in the Categories and in the 5th book of Wisdom, before he talks about opposition, right? That's the basis of the distinction. Okay. But there are four kinds of opposites, and that would be a whole study in itself. Yeah.
In the commentary on the sentences of Peter the Lombard, where we have the distinctions, would they be used in that sense or in a different sense?
You mean for the Trinity, you mean, or what?
Or for any of the parts in the commentaries on,
Yeah, that's a little different sense there, I mean, involves making distinctions, right? You see? But it's like the word, speech and rhetoric, It's a little different sense than what we had in mind. Yeah. But they would involve it, a distinction in there, yeah. Yeah. I was thinking more of the idea we're investigating the question, coming to a more distinct knowledge of whatever the question is about, right? Okay. Now, one more thing that we point out there towards the end of that part on division there is that a division should exhaust, right, all the parts, right? Okay. And some people want to say that the word division comes from the word divide, and divide comes from empty, right? So in a way, when you divide something, you're emptying it out, right? There's nothing left there, right? There should be nothing left in there, right? And if I divide triangles into equilateral, say, and isosceles, there's still something in the basket still, right? It's KD, right? You didn't get them all out, right? Now we come to my invention here, the rule of 2 or 3, right? Okay. And I begin with the question, whether there's any number into which you should divide, right? Okay. And can you give any rule about this, right? Okay. I don't think you can give a rule that is true universally for any number to divide into, right? I think you can give a rule that is true for the most part, right? Okay. But the way to approach this is kind of dialectically. And if you go down to the history of philosophy, you'll see that there are 2 famous thinkers who were known for always dividing into a particular number, right? In the dialogues of Plato, when you get into division there, in the dialogue called the Sophist and so on, Socrates is always dividing into what? 2, right? Okay, Socrates or Plato, right? You don't know who's original there. Okay? But Socrates or Plato in the dialogues is always divided into two. In Aristotle, the pupil of Plato, in the biological works there, he criticizes the Platonists for always dividing into two, right? Okay? But notice, Plato is one of the chief philosophers.